seventh console generation came and went as the longest-lasting generation in video game history. The market between 2005 and 2012 had more than its fair share of action shooters, both in the third and the first-person points of view. Motion controls brought the Wii into homes of millions, and plastic instruments made video games a party experience once again. But for the most part, big developers stopped making new horror games. Konami's Silent Hill franchise flailed with Silent Hill Homecoming and Silent Hill Downpour, both receiving mixed to poor receptions from fans and critics alike. And though Capcom revolutionized the horror industry multiple times with their Resident Evil franchise, Resident Evil 5 was received well enough, but it leaned more heavily on action compared to Resident Evil 4, which had superior mood, story, and setting. Resident Evil 6 was just a mess. PC gamers were enjoying the Penumbra and Amnesia franchises by Frictional Games, which were developed on super small budgets. But on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, horror seemed to have lost its way, until Dead Space came onto the scene.
What did they find aboard the ship, Isaac?
The marker.
Did you have contact with this marker? It made you see things, didn't it? Things you didn't want to see.
It spoke to me.
And what did it say, Isaac? What did it say to you, Isaac? Isaac, can you hear me?
Dead Space released just in time for Halloween on October 13th, 2008 for the PC, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. Its success allowed for 2 official sequels and a smattering of spin-offs in the forms of comics, animated films, puzzle games, and more. The Dead Space trilogy is one of the quintessential horror experiences of the console generation, and the series has aged surprisingly well. There is almost a genealogy of horror films, books and shows and video games that you can use to trace a series' inspiration. For example, George Romero released Night of the Living Dead in 1968, which was heavily inspired by 1964's The Last Man on Earth, which was based on the 1954 novel I Am Legend by Richard Matheson.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
And of course, Night of the Living Dead is a huge inspiration for the ultra-popular Resident Evil franchise. Within the world of video games, Silent Hill was Konami's response to Resident Evil, and funnily enough, Resident Evil 7 was massively inspired by PT, the interactive teaser for the cancelled Silent Hill game, Silent Hills. So even within specific series, there can be a lot of inspirational inbreeding. But where does Dead Space Trilogy sit in this family tree of the macabre? What are its roots, and how has it inspired video games and horror? The original Dead Space actually came about when Visceral Games, the studio known as EA Redwood up until 2009, was kicking around the idea of crafting a sequel to System Shock. And their goal was to create a game that both newcomers and fans would enjoy that wasn't developed by the original System Shock team. But after playing and obsessing over Resident Evil 4, designers Ben Wanat and Wright Bagwell ended up with something very similar to Resident Evil 4, but in space. So Dead Space became its own franchise. But Dead Space is a much more complex amalgamation than just RE4 plus System Shock. It's clear the design team scoured as many horror sources as they possibly could to make the game as creepy as possible and still remain marketable. The Alien franchise obviously plays a huge role. The original of both franchises are the stories of heroes trapped in space and facing off against a monster, or monsters, using improvised tools to protect themselves after discovering something thought to be benign on an alien planet. Even the monsters from the 2 franchises share similar names. In the Alien franchise, the monsters are called xenomorphs. In Dead Space, the reanimated living tissue monsters are called necromorphs. We have facehuggers for both, and human beings kept alive and suffering for incubation purposes.
You're gonna be alright.
Please. Kill me.
Both the Alien franchise and the Dead Space franchise owe their successes to an even earlier film, 1958's The Fly.
You saw the fly? Where?
It's in a web. Spider's going to get it. By the bench, in the garden.
You're sure?
Oh, yes.
Yes, the 1986 version with Jeff Goldblum gets more love these days, but the original film has always scared me more. Plus, it's one of the original body horror films. The Fly's influence can be seen in some subtle and not so subtle ways.
Give me a hand! No, I got it! You're gonna take me, please! Cover now!
The Metroid franchise. Now, I know what many people might be thinking right now. Isn't Metroid just Nintendo's video game version of the Alien series? It totally is. Head-latching monsters, the creature Ridley, named after Ridley Scott, looks like a xenomorph, lead female protagonists that get down to their skivvies at the end. But there's so much that Metroid did in video game form that couldn't have been done on film. For example, Metroid was one of the first video games to truly nail down that sense of isolation. One hero in an unknown setting surrounded entirely by monsters. The only way to get to safety is through the heart of the swarm. My favorite little nod to Metroid, the player doesn't get to see the protagonist Isaac Clarke's face until the very end of the game. Until then, he's just a person in a cool spacesuit blasting away at monsters and solving light puzzles. Just like Samus. Paul Anderson's Event Horizon bombed at the box office in 1997, but it still found a home in the hearts of science fiction and horror geeks alike. The plot? A small team is sent to a large derelict ship to assess why it went dark, and what's found on the ship is nothing but horrors! Both of the psychological and physical varieties. And of course, both heroes of the film and Dead Space have a lost love interest on the ships that they're trying to rescue, and spoiler alert, they're both dead. A little bit like Silent Hill 2. Just a little.
Isaac, where are you? It's me, Nicole.
Jurassic Park might not be a traditional horror film, it's more of a science fiction adventure romp. But that didn't stop its influence from sneaking into the Dead Space trilogy. Introduced in Dead Space 2, the Stalker necromorph acts and visually resembles the velociraptors that Spielberg made famous in 1993. They communicate through chirps and whistles, they attack in numbers and attempt to flank the player from the sides, they love to peek their heads around the corner and catch a glimpse of the player.
Clever girl.
Compared to other necromorphs in the game that charge blindly at the player, the AI patterns of the Stalkers is much more complex. In fact, players get an achievement called Clever Girls after surviving their first encounter with the monsters. Hey, that officially makes 2 Sam Neill movies on this list. Certainly, there are dozens of other major and minor influences that either consciously or unconsciously made their way into the Dead Space trilogy. No matter how you slice it, Dead Space is still fun horror. At the time of this video, it has been almost 10 years since the original Dead Space's release. How does each game in the trilogy hold up?
Alright, everyone, we're here. Sinking our orbit now.
All this trouble over that chunk of rock.
Deep space mining is a lucrative business, Miss Daniels. Aegis 7 is a gold mine according to prospectors' reports.
Isaac Clarke and a small crew respond to a distress signal call from the Ishimura, a ship designed to mine entire planets of their resources. Clark's girlfriend, Nicole Brennan, is a senior medical officer on board the Ishimura. Clark and team are ambushed by necromorphs. Clark, being an engineer and not trained for combat, fights back using mining tools as improvised weapons. Necromorphs, though zombie-like, are not fazed much by headshots, but are most vulnerable to dismemberment. The humans on board the Ishimura start to turn into necromorphs after being exposed to the marker that was found on the planet below. The marker initially causes hallucinations of dead loved ones, it instills homicidal or suicidal tendencies, and eventually, the humans turn into monsters.
I can hear them moving outside, but I don't think they know I'm in here. I can log into everything from here. I hacked the route and found some reports from the colony. Even before they cracked the planet, the colonists were experiencing widespread dementia. It seems to be related to some artifact they found on the planet. Something called the Marker.
The Marker is a symbol of the religion Unitology, the dominant religion in the Dead Space universe. Its followers are taught to not fear death, but to welcome it, because death will bring them enlightenment and reunite them with their loved ones.
The Marker is glorious and divine. You know that.
God moves in mysterious ways.
Anyway, we'll have it on board tomorrow. You can analyze it all you want to. What are you so worried about?
Worried? Captain, people are dying down there, killing each other. Is this madness, the transformation Unitology teaches us?
Throughout most of the adventure, Nicole contacts Clark, begging him to hurry so they may be reunited and made whole. Nicole is in fact dead, and has been dead for the entire game. Because of his proximity to the Marker, Clark has been hallucinating her messages the entire time. Fun fact! If you take the first letter of each chapter title from the original Dead Space and line them up, they spell out, Nicole is dead. If you do that with Dead Space 2, it doesn't spell anything. Clark is the lone survivor of the events on board the Ishimura, and as he flies away in an escape shuttle after battling a gigantic tentacle monster, Clark hallucinates a now violent Nicole as the screen flashes to black. Dead Space 1 is a true survival horror experience, and it doesn't approach its scares through one method. There's the psychological horror of Nicole's storyline. There are plenty of jump scares, buckets of gore, unnerving body horror monster design, but the game also focuses on more primal fears. You are in the dark, in claustrophobic hallways, isolated from humanity in the ship around you, and the ship itself is in deep space. And everything is trying to kill you. And ammunition is in short supply. Played on PC, Dead Space still holds up very, very well. It has amazing sound design. It won both Audio of the Year and Sound Design of the Year by the Game Audio Network Guild in 2009. It has fascinating lore, with plenty of places to dust off more story through video, audio, or text logs. And though some of the textures are a little weak, the excellent visual models and lighting help carry the experience. Compared to Resident Evil 4, Clark could move and shoot at the same time, and accessing the inventory did not pause the game. Instead, the action and the danger continues to swirl around the player. Dead Space's HUD-less design put key information in more stylish and functional areas. The player's health appears along Clark's spine, and ammunition is continually displayed near whichever weapon was held in hand. Resident Evil pioneered third-person shooters, but Dead Space helped push HUD design in new and fascinating directions for all video games.
I can explain everything, but you gotta trust me, okay? Listen, you're in terrible, terrible danger.
Isaac Clarke wakes up in a space station asylum on Saturn's moon Titan. 3 years have passed since the events of Dead Space, and Clarke has no memory of his time that's gone by. What's worse, there is already a massive necromorph outbreak that swept through the station. While Clarke was mute in the first Dead Space, this time around Clarke has a voice. Giving voice to his character was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gives Clarke independence, and it doesn't force him to simply follow the directions of other characters in the story. On the other hand, it removes some of the immersion that was found in the original Dead Space.
Isaac, no! This is a really bad idea.
Well, stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
Isaac continues to have hallucinations of his dead girlfriend, Nicole. In fact, they're getting worse.
How do you do it? How do you hold it all inside? Your face never betraying your pain. No one would ever know the guilt you feel. Never know the dark thoughts you keep.
Clark has been abducted by the religious group the Unitologists to crack his mind and gain a better understanding of the markers. The markers not only create necromorphs, but commands them to spread convergence across the universe.
Everything that's happening on this station is happening because of that marker. I have to get to it and destroy it, and I need Strauss to tell me how.
You're a strange man, Isaac.
Isaac encounters a CEC pilot named Ellie Langford, who helps Isaac escape, but not before losing her eye to Strauss, another patient who's been tortured by the Unitologists and gone insane.
You owe me an eye, you bastard!
Though Isaac is blasting away at the reanimated corpses of the space station's inhabitants, men, women, and children alike, his biggest demon is coping with the loss of Nicole and the guilt that he carries, being unable to reach his beloved in time to save her before the events of Dead Space 1. Meeting a new love interest in Ellie obviously sparks further internal conflict. Eventually, the necromorph infestation decimates the entire space station. Ellie and Isaac make it out by the skin of their teeth. Some of the scare tactics of Dead Space 1 had to be removed for Dead Space 2. It's a considerably less frightening game to many. When you're not stuck on a spaceship, there are fewer claustrophobic areas. With Isaac constantly chattering to someone, the player feels less alone. However, that didn't stop Dead Space 2 from having some genuine scares. It relied on different scare tactics. It was twice as visually disturbing. It includes exploding infant necromorphs and hordes of children necromorphs attacking the player from a daycare. And though there are some brightly lit areas, that only makes the contrast more dynamic when the lights go very dark. Dead Space 2 also fleshes out the exposition of Unitology more, and with it, players had to navigate the confusing funhouse-like hallways of the game's religious areas.
What the fuck are you doing? Shit! Help! I'm trying! I'm trying!
If you didn't have ometophobia before Dead Space 2, you might have it afterwards. The game loves going for the eyes. Literally, with gigantic needles and screwdrivers. Make you tear up a little bit? Okay, moving on then. Though Dead Space 2 had much more shooting and vastly improved controls, ammunition was still in short supply. Both the original Dead Space and Dead Space 2 nailed their economic systems. When every encounter is a deadly one, an empty magazine can be your worst enemy. At the time of its release, many mainstream video games had unnecessary multiplayer modes tacked on. Dead Space 2 was no different. It featured a competitive multiplayer mode of monsters versus humans that was probably inspired by Left 4 Dead or Left 4 Dead 2's successful multiplayer modes. EA heavily encouraged Visceral to implement microtransactions and multiplayer modes to increase revenue, but both of those models seemed to go against almost everything that made Dead Space such a successful franchise. And then Dead Space 3 came around.
I got it! Get it under control! I'm full thrusters! It's slowing! Okay. Okay. There we go. Jesus. Let's not do that again.
Dead Space 3 is the inevitable death of all successful horror franchises if they overstay their welcome. Eventually, 4 things can happen. 1. The scares are all used up, and audiences are desensitized to the monsters on screen. 2. The publisher demands to market to a wider audience and increase revenue. This alienates the core base. It's important to note that mismarketing any game can mean doom, but an established horror franchise is especially delicate. 3. In order to stay fresh, creators need to come up with new content, whether that be expanded lore, or introduce new characters, or even new types of frights. Horror absolutely depends upon a massive suspense of disbelief. These new X factors can be too silly, either intentionally or unintentionally, and that will shatter the suspension and dissolve the horror entirely, even though we all know in the back of our minds it's just a game. It's sort of a hypocritical line of logic, but that's how our minds work, sadly. 4. The series loses relevance. Good horror is always socially relevant, universally, culturally, or perhaps to a very specific subgroup of people. All 4 of those things happened to Dead Space 3. Between the events of Dead Space 2 and 3, Ellie and Isaac are a couple and then break up. Much of the story here is fleshed out in the graphic novel Dead Space Liberation. Ellie teams up with and begins dating Captain Robert Norton. Norton and Sergeant John Carver lose Ellie as she makes an uncalculated shock point jump to the planet Tall Volantis, the supposed homeworld of the markers that create necromorphs. At the beginning of Dead Space 3, Carver and Norton grab Isaac and sort of force him to help them find her and hopefully put a stop to the necromorph threat once and for all. Dead Space 3 does a lot of things right. It expands upon the zero-G gameplay that was available in Dead Space 2. It is a competent and downright fun cooperative shooter. The visuals hold up very well today, and the sound design is as good as it's always been. But almost everything else about it goes 100% against what made the first 2 Dead Space games good.
Well, that sounds familiar. At least they didn't poke her eye out. I'll be there soon.
I'll try to burn through some of the low points, because the list of the things that Dead Space 3 does wrong could be a video all of its own. By this point, the story has become overly complicated. The beauty of Dead Space 1 was its simplicity. Dead Space 2 brought in more substance, but by the start of Dead Space 3, the player is asking, who are half of these people and why should I care? From a survival horror gameplay point of view, everything was demolished. The cramped, claustrophobic, or labyrinthine, ill-lit corridors have been traded in for wide-open, super well-lit spaces. Ammunition and health supplies are everywhere. Weapons are no longer improvised means of self-defense. Instead, they are megaguns, taped on top of other megaguns. Players could still dismember enemies, but body shots seemed to do just as much damage in Dead Space 3, removing the surgical precision needed in the player's aim. In short, it was created for the standard third-person shooter crowd, but targeted to horror fans, and it was purchased by neither. Though competently built, it was mismarketed from almost the ground up. And nothing cuts tension of a horror experience like chatting away and joking with a friend. When played cooperatively, Dead Space 3 simply isn't that scary. The Dead Space experience could have been wrapped up with Dead Space 2. Dead Space 1 being about trying to reach Isaac's beloved. Dead Space 2 is coping with her loss. Nothing more needed to be said about Clark's story arc. He's not that interesting of a character. He was meant to be a blank slate, just another engineer with no combat experience, so players could attach their egos to him. Dead Space 3 comes around, and suddenly he's competing for his ex-girlfriend's attention, and he's more Rambo than John Rambo. And to top it off, Isaac is the chattiest he's ever been, and he comes across as a gigantic jerk. So, how were players meant to root for his victory?
Hey, what's up with the oxygen injector? Suck on there, not locked down.
I tried, but the threads are rusty.
Well, let me see what I can do. If one of those pops loose, the cabin fire is going to burn us up before the atmosphere does. Do me a favor. Find the pressure reading on the main console and let me know when I have a solid seal.
But perhaps players only wanted another game to shoot the strange-looking monsters once again. Even that audience would be disappointed. A good portion of the game deals with shooting actual humans, completely blurring the lines between Dead Space and every other generic shooter on the market. In an even bigger slap to the face of the franchise and the fans, there are portions of the game where necromorphs know how to use guns. Yeah. The only thing moderately interesting about Dead Space 3 is it adds some lore about necromorphs. Turns out the markers not only influence people to act erratically, but it aids in the evolution of organic life on planets, including Earth. The end goal is to create enough organic life, and then combine it all together in a gigantic squid moon that devours all life on other planets. The final battle of Dead Space 3, Isaac and Carver literally fight a squid moon and then destroy it. They fall to the planet below, they are assumed dead, Dead Space is over, roll the credits. Except, Dead Space 3 had a DLC pack called Awakened that continued their story. John and Isaac wake up on the planet after destroying the necromorph moon, only to find out that the necromorphs still exist. The two lose trust in one another and struggle with whether or not they are actually alive. Have they turned into necromorphs? Is this sort of an afterlife where they're struggling with internal demons? Spoiler alert, they're both alive, which is ridiculous. Neither are necromorphs, and the other necromorph moons are headed towards Earth to devour all life there. The two rush to find a ship to head home and warn Earth. Just as Earth enters into their view, several necromorph moons pop up and the screen fades to black. Carver and Clark can either be assumed dead or unconscious. Dead Space 3 Awakened should have been the entire game. Struggling with the concept of what is life, death, or undeath could have been fascinating avenues to explore, but sadly in this short form, the game never gets into anything good. Conceptually, it could have stood on its own as a frightening experience, bringing in more existential questions like Soma from Frictional Games. It could have made the original two Dead Space games stronger experiences by proxy. Instead, it feels like a tacked-on apology letter to the core fanbase. Dead Space 3 was sort of a pioneer for in-game transactions for non-competitive games. At the time, many large publishers were toying with the idea, but Dead Space was one of the first big franchises to cross the line. Players could use real money to purchase very minor things like outfits, guns, extra ammunition, and health supplies. It didn't sit well amongst gamers, and fans had a great reason to be upset. The super balanced economy of Dead Space 1 and 2 that added to the tension of both games was gone. It's almost an analogy in itself of the entire Dead Space franchise. Visceral Games trying to please as many people as possible and pull in larger profits with every release, but in the end, not really pleasing anyone. Dead Space 3 sold well under EA's projections, and it's unlikely that the Dead Space franchise will continue.
Hazardous condition. Please contact repair specialist.
Good horror almost always comes with some form of social commentary, and Dead Space is no different. Of course, like all subtext, it's ripe for personal interpretation. The original Dead Space could be an allegory for environmentalism. All of the trouble on board of the Ishimura starts when humans greedily mine a planet for all its resources. This is a fairly common horror theme. You can find it in The Thing, Tremors, Godzilla, and countless other classics. But Dead Space could also be about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Humans going to a resource-rich area, Aegis 7, against governmental approval with underlying religious motivations. Sounds pretty similar to George W. Bush going to war without UN approval and his hypothesized religious reasons for doing so. Dead Space 2 takes a different tone. A large portion of the game deals with the human element of the necromorphs, namely the religion that supports them. Yes, the monsters are frightening, but the humans are more so. And though the parable is a little more shallow, it's a warning against blindly following religion, or any hive mind mentality, especially to the extreme. More specifically, the game seems to be a statement about the religion Scientology. The two religions, Unitology and Scientology, share similar names. A lot of the marketing campaigns for Unitology in Dead Space 2 look very similar to Scientology ones in real life. They are both religions based upon humanity coming from extraterrestrial sources. Isaac, the only clear-sighted one, helps Ellie escape even after she is almost literally blinded by an extremist group's version of the truth. Dead Space 3 tags along with Dead Space 2's metaphors, but for the most part, it's just a shooter. It's another huge reason why Dead Space 3 simply doesn't hold a candle to its predecessors. Dead Space, as a series, is almost certainly over. At the end of its life cycle, it simply didn't sell enough for EA to reinvest in it once again. I, for one, hope that it's gone for good. I love it, but I only want to hear from Dead Space again in the form of a remastered complete edition of the entire franchise. I don't want a reboot, or a spin-off, or a sequel. Nothing is worse for a horror franchise than unnecessary filler. The beauty of Dead Space was, even though it took inspiration from a pile of horror franchises, it still gave us something original enough to savor. Its legacy may never be as glamorous as the Silent Hill or Resident Evil franchises. It might not have a long-term impact on horror films and games, but that doesn't mean its influences can't be or won't be found. Every time you see a well-designed, HUD-less game, you should think of Dead Space. Or if a single-player game chooses to amplify immersion by removing ambient music and instead focuses on ambient sound effects, you should think of Dead Space. However, every time you see a non-competitive AAA game that sells in-game items for real-world currency, you should frown and think of what Dead Space 3 could have been.